Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm here today on December 8th, I believe, 2016, with Dr. Sally Feather at the Rhine Research Center. And my name is Lisette Coly. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation. And I wanted to speak to Sally today because she and I find ourselves in a strange sort of relationship because we sort of have parallel interests and family histories.
We do.
So we want to talk about that because, Sally, you're the daughter of J.B. Rhine.
Right. And Louisa Rhine.
And Louisa Rhine, and who's happily referred to very often as the father of parapsychology,
Yes,
correct?
I think he is.
Definitely. And I'm the granddaughter of Eileen J. Garrett, who did some pretty famous card-guessing experiments way back in the day, I think in
She
1934?
Maybe the top medium in this country and Europe or England, at least.
Yes,
certainly.
at the time, yeah.
Yeah.
She came over in 1931. The ASPR brought her over for experimentation.
Okay.
And I think your father, how did he get involved in this? He was the protege of Angus McDougall, was he, to a certain extent, or no?
Well, he came down here to Durham, North Carolina, where Duke University is, and where the British psychologist William McDougall was just been hired to start the new psychology department at Duke, but he was also a psychic researcher. And
I think that's how Garrett.
that was
the connection, because Garrett worked with him in the late 20s. McDougall
in England, probably, or
yes,
perhaps.
Exactly.
And so Garrett was known by McDougall to be a reputable medium and very interested in helping people with the research part of it, not just the mediumship part of it. And so, with knowing that was the connection, I think, that led Garrett to come down here and agree to come down to the new Duke University and the laboratory that my father had set up here.
Now, would that have been predating before it was the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man?
Oh, yes.
This was
still
in the university.
The Duke Parapsychology Laboratory was the first formal beginning of research on what was then called psychical research and got to be called parapsychology. And my father's work, I guess, was mainly known. He was the first one to not the first one to make experimental tests of so-called psychic matters, but systematically. So it didn't just begin and then end with one experiment. It went on and on and on, and here we are today as the survivor of that original laboratory.
Original work together, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you must have been rather young in the 30s, dear.
Well, I was born in 1930, so it's easy to figure it out. I can always still figure out how old I am because I go back to that.
Well, that's interesting because I read somewhere that J.B. had said that that McDougall, when she came down here, had asked EJG while holding Rhine's youngest baby about the empathy that she felt between child and whatever. And I wondered at the time, are you the youngest?
No,
were you of
that would have been my sister Rosie, who's still living out in near Portland, Oregon, and I correspond with her a lot. So it would be her. She would, or in probably that year, 34, I believe. And when Garrett did, was that when Garrett first came here? I forgot the original dates. 33, 34.
31 or 32, I think, the States. And I know my mother, Eileen Coly, who was Parapsychology Foundation's second president, who died in 2013, she always remembers as a Brit having sailed transatlantically and gotten to New York and from London, but then she got on the train with Mrs. G, and when they got off the train in Durham and looked around, they thought, God's truth, we're at
the end of the world.
Exactly.
Well, my mother came when they moved down here in 1927. For almost the first thing she would do was to look for a bookstore. Well, there wasn't any.
Oh, really?
In fact, I don't think all the streets in town were paved. It was really, really the boonies.
Really? Yeah.
It was in the edge of the. And when they moved out here, it was from. Now they were from Ohio, which wasn't the most highly developed place like New York City was, but North Carolina was very rural, and Duke University was a new university, which was one reason why you could get by with studying psychical research.
You could get in the back door.
Yeah, back door. You've got to be a new place where they're open to new things and new ideas. You don't see that happening now too many
No, it's the
universities.
back door is firmly
back doors.
closed. Well, Garrett, who was known to be extremely flamboyant with furs and turbans and dingle dangle, she must have gone over really well in over here. No.
Well, she was exotic.
Well, what do you remember?
Well,
Because she
'cause
made several trips
Oh,
back
yes,
and down. I think
right. And now she came several times in those early years to do the experimental work with the Zener cards, which for her are ESP cards, as they're more appropriately called.
Well, let me stop you for a moment because there's another. I don't know if you're aware of the fact my mother was always rather embarrassed because in this first trip,
Yes.
and she would have been, I don't know, maybe 17, 18, apparently JB ushers Mrs. G off to whatever to do the card guessing, and leaving my mother to just vamp till ready.
Sit
and
out of
they
the...
handed her a packet of the cards. I don't know if are the cards in the frame, the center cards.
Okay.
So she was busy, looking at those, and a tall gentleman comes into the room, and my mother tried to be, social and said, "Oh, look at that! Have you seen these lovely cards? Isn't this interesting?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I made them," and it was Carl.
Oh, Carl Zener himself. Now that's an interesting anecdote. I had not heard that.
Yeah,
because later he asked to have his name removed, and they
why
really
was
shouldn't
that?
be.
Why was
Well,
that?
he was a professional colleague. He was a psychologist.
Right.
Okay. He, a new department with 4 or 5 young people who are just hired as the new psychology instructors. Work together as a team to begin with. You're doing this, I'll help you. So he was helping my father develop symbols which they thought would be
Psychologically,
easy to remember. But if you ask, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 5. Well, that is. They've got a lot of problems with that, but there's 5 symbols, and that's a little more interesting if you're asking somebody to guess what I'm thinking of or what's in this card I've got hidden here. So he just helped. He was a professor of perception. So,
okay, so that's
he was interested in visual perception, and that was his expertise. So he designed this for his buddy, his friend. Then later, when JB starts getting all the attention and the press and these other professors are, and it didn't go over so well, so they gradually drew back. And later JB was happy to be independent on a separate department. The laboratory was separate from the Department of Psychology.
Paddle his own canoe.
After a while, So that happened. But at the time, Carl Zener would have been just around helping. So the anecdote. Later I had a course with... Later, I went to graduate school at Duke University in 1960s, and Carl Zener was still living, and I remember having a course with him.
Oh, really? So, did he know who you were?
Oh, yes. Yes. They all knew who I was. She was Dr. Rhine's daughter coming in, psychology department. I never mentioned parapsychology or what I was doing. I was just another graduate student. That was the easiest way for all of us. But they were very friendly and cordial.
Well, do you share the same experience that I do? And maybe I do a little bit more because Garrett was known to be very flamboyant, as a word I continually use. But JB had such stature and was so patrician and this and that I find that either people are drawn and they take 3 steps closer to me, and probably to you because they're an or they take 3 steps back because they figure, and the majority of people don't really give a damn.
Right.
But
and this
I
is
find
one
it's
reason,
all or nothing. It's either side of the coin, right?
This is one reason why I always like to talk to you, because we have a common history, and yet it's from a different point of view. You're from the New York area, and just no, you don't wear a turban like your grandmother did.
No. I have long hair. She eschewed this short
But she would come in. My real memories of her are really not until I was a teenager, and she came on the day, must have been the day I was 16. That would have been 1946. I can still remember that because not only was she to me exotic with her turban and an entourage, and I don't remember if mother was along. I would have thought she was a secretary or something.
16? When were you 16?
In 1946, your mother would have been.
She might have been. Yeah,
she could have been,
because I wasn't born until 50, so she was junketing around. She was in
and I would have just
might have done.
not noticed her.
But
because
my mother was very quiet and sort of.
That's right. You would have only noticed Eileen and
yes,
Mrs.
for sure.
Garrett, and she was
only one diva in the family.
So she was invited out to the house for supper, and we were, just an ordinary family supper with probably all 4 children there. Nothing unusual. My mother probably cooked it and served it. I certainly didn't have servants. And she gave me a present, my 16th birthday.
Oh,
here's this
really?
lady visiting my dad. The people came in and
yeah,
out.
I mean, yeah.
A present one. It was a silver, a chunky silver neck
Charm bracelet?
bracelet,
Or
a charm bracelet. Now, do we
Because she
even know
bought
what
me
a charm bracelet is?
as a kid. So
Okay.
it must have been a thing of
Then
hers.
she knew that. Yeah, okay. It was. I still have that. Actually, I gave that bracelet to my daughter, who will treasure it forever. It's still in existence.
Cool?
But I don't know if I ever wore it because it was so exotic. But I know I would sit and play with it or look at it and admire it for hours. And
Interesting.
But I'll always remember that. But I remember her as just this unusual person, exotic, coming into the laboratory. And my father was obviously very impressed with her. If he liked somebody, then we knew they were all right. She passed the test. My mother was more quiet, but just a matter-of-fact person in the background, kind of like your mother.
Well, maybe like you say, you have to have somebody to the fore.
Around, right? And she did all the things probably which your mother might have done. Although she was on a same intellectual level with my dad. She knew just as much about what was going on.
The programming and the appointments and
Right.
all the grunt work, right?
She just kept
to
in the
make
background.
thing going.
And he'd probably go home and say, "Oh, how do I handle Mrs. Bolton or Mrs. Garrett?" Or
Well, that's true,
he
because
might have.
of course they would know Mrs. Bolton, because we could discuss Mrs. Bolton, because
Mrs.
that's
Bolton.
a whole history.
That's right.
Right?
And you
Because
can
now,
talk openly about that now. The
For
family
sure.
has allowed you to
for
do
sure,
that.
yes, for sure, because Mrs. Bolton was the Parapsychology Foundation's benefactress, and she was I guess really a best friend, because Garrett didn't have girlfriends. I mean, this is not the
She
lady
didn't,
that
no,
lunches.
no.
But these two, Garrett and Bolton, I think they got to know each other in, I think, the late 20s. Bolton was in London, probably going to the college for psychic readings, met
Going
Garrett.
to England for psychic
Yes,
readings because
and would have
Garrett was
met-
one of the people
exactly.
you could.
And they sort of hit it off. I mean, obviously she was in the beginning utilizing Garrett's skill set as a medium, but apart from that, because I think they were just two oddballs, there was somehow a meeting of the minds.
Well, I can see by the letters that I'm now seeing again. I never saw them, but the letters that were written in 1933 and along in there, that it was really Mrs. Garrett was the funding behind your mother coming down here and all that and making all this
Mrs.
possible.
Bolton, yes, Mrs.
Bolton was.
Yeah, Garrett would talk Mrs. Bolton into
But that-
opening her checkbook.
Right, and she would say nice things about having come down here if she liked. Now, if she had not liked JB and the lab,
You would have no.
it would have that would have been the end of that.
No, exactly.
But she paved the way. Now, he was, let's say, he was only in his late 30s about that time. He wouldn't have even been 40. So he wasn't that sophisticated. And this is a man
been
who was
pretty heady
a
stuff to
farmer, from the farmlands of Ohio, didn't grow up in a professional family, worked his way up, the closest thing he had a mentor would be McDougall, who would kind of tell him how to act about things like that. That was before Dr. Murphy, who was another mentor for
Murphy,
him.
sure, yeah.
They
And
helped each other.
definitely.
So it was, but meeting Mrs. Garrett then, and then other times, I don't know that I think she did come down other times. I mean, we had a family joke because she wore this green turban, and I keep mentioning that because it became later we discovered my little son couldn't tell his
he's
colors.
colorblind?
Colorblind. His browns were green as green, and he would talk about the green lady.
The Green Lady.
We Green Lady, and we couldn't think who he was talking about. He was very impressed. Now it might have been later. He might have been talking about an African American lady, or he might have been talking about her because she was green.
With the green.
Green, but she was young enough that he was young enough that we couldn't.
Interesting.
But so I always remember her in that way.
Interesting.
But I would remember her anyway. She
Well,
was
I know
somebody you didn't forget.
Well, no, and Mrs. Bolton was apart from being fabulously wealthy, part of the Payne family and the Bolton family, which was old Standard Oil money.
Was that it?
But then she was one of the only. She took over in Congress when her husband. She was a Republican.
That's right. She
Congresswoman
was representative from Ohio.
From Ohio.
One of the first women, probably.
Yeah, well, that would have
Frances
been
Payne
difficult
Bolton.
for your father as well as anybody else, because in those days you did not have women in authority, in power, that were roaming around, living life their way, which was not the norm when you were supposed to be stirring the pot, right? I mean, so women's lib had not arrived at that point.
I didn't ever sense any sense of. Well, I mean, JB was a man of his time, and he might call you sweetie or honey, because my husband still does that, and not know the proper terms. But I don't sense any gender bias of his part. Some of his early
I just thought that they might be somewhat
colleagues
out of
were
the,
women.
out of the norm. Well, and his wife, his life partner, was his equal.
She's just as educated
Exactly.
as he was, too.
Exactly. I know I found within Garrett's book, Adventures in the Supernormal, which is not a commercial per se, but it can't
book.
hurt.
Yes.
In any case, I noticed that she said that she was particularly impressed with JB's directness, simplicity, and enthusiasm, which sort of fits pretty much dovetailing what your take with
exactly,
the gentleman.
right.
So in referencing Mrs. Bolton, now let's talk about the money that came to Duke, because I always said, and I want to hear your side of the equation, that I think Mrs. Bolton, Garrett convinced Mrs. Bolton to give some money to the lab. And I think she had it earmarked in her own mind. Mrs. Bolton was particularly interested in survival research and mediumship stuff.
Right.
And I always, and I think JB, and you're going to speak to that, was not comfortable or went in other directions, probably more in an experimental laboratory manner. And that sort of displeased Mrs. Bolton. And so they came to a parting of the ways, and the money, I don't know if it came back or the faucet was turned off in some fashion.
Right.
And I always think, and my mother used to agree with me, that in a large part, the birth of the foundation, which took until 1951, was in large part a reaction to the fact that the two ladies didn't get the experimentation, or they didn't have it done the way they saw it happening. And they thought about that, and in 1951 decided to do it their own way, and that's probably the genesis for the birth of the Parapsychology Foundation.
It probably is. I don't know that for a fact,
because what actually went down, Sally?
Well, I don't know it that way. I'll back up a little bit and say that JB, as he got into the field, was really interested in the survival question. That was his major for getting there.
He a divinity student too?
He was frustrated when he got to college by the science courses. Once he discovered science, then he lost his religion with that. But he kept on with the big questions in life, like if everyone else is talking about these religious concepts, why can't we find scientific evidence for them? That was the bottom line of his life. If, for the power of prayer or healing, any of these things that we think are so important, or how communication between people extrasensorially, if that's there, then why isn't there evidence for us? And certainly, if there's an afterlife. And he had a lot of reason to be interested in the afterlife, because mediumship was pretty popular in those days. In fact, this marvelous medium, supposedly marvelous medium in Boston named Marjorie.
Yes, he got involved.
He was so excited about that, and he really thought that.
But he didn't get to sleep with Marjorie, did he?
No.
Everybody else did.
I know that might have been why she was so popular. But he didn't get that close to her, because the first seance, the first time he ever saw the seance, he saw the fraud. And other people in the room didn't seem to see it.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Now, he was just out of not medical school, but graduate school, so he saw things more carefully. That really destroyed his world for then. But he kept on for a whole year in Boston looking for more evidence. Mrs. Soul and other mediums couldn't find anything. Even when he came back down here and started working with McDougall, it was still looking for survival evidence. And he kept on, couldn't really find anything, and finally, this is before Garrett came on the scene, finally said, look, that's not the way to go.
Or it's not.
But there may be something to telepathy, so we can measure that. It's more like, what can you measure?
Yes.
What can you study? It wasn't saying that's not true. It's just saying we don't know how to study.
I'll take that avenue.
They were trying to study. He was sending little psychometry things to mediums to try to get feedback.
I found a bunch of that.
He was doing some methodology.
Files.
Yes, good.
That they would send up envelopes or whatever.
He was trying to get her to...
Yes.
Yeah, and so he was trying to find evidence of that.
He was interested in psychometry. I'm not Garrett, but I'm personally interested in psychometry.
Yes, I think that's a great way of studying mediumship.
What happened to psychometry? I always try and convince people nowadays.
It could still be studied.
But it's not. Well, I guess everything.
I don't know. The mediums
yang.
do none. Some of the mediums probably use that.
Yes,
I like that. One of the mediums that we know does.
But it's not as common as it used to be.
Why it fell out of favor? Somebody should write a history. Maybe you can do that of trends in psychic research and how they go one way and then the other.
Yeah,
but he got sidetracked into something that could be studied, in a controlled way, where you don't have to trust somebody and you don't have to constantly check everything they say against somebody else's readings. And
because his research that he did with Garrett in the 30s was not really mediumship based at all, right?
It was studying to see if she was psychic, and clearly confirmed. I mean, she did remarkably well on the EFT
She didn't
cards.
like those cards.
No. She was polite enough not to say it then.
Oh, because I found it. Did not like those cards because there was no emotional connection to it.
Yeah. All that's very valid points. But in order to get the evidence, there were people who would do that, and she did it. She did a lot of work for him, and not only in her own awake state, but in her trance state. Ivani came through, and he also did well. She did better by herself than Ivani did.
Managed
but both of them did. Now, little did she know it, but that was, of course, people who believe in all mediumship is just super psi. Say, aha, you see, Mrs. Garrett is psychic and so forth.
Yeah,
I don't look at it that way. I look at it that she could be sitting here right now and telling me what's going to happen to me tomorrow. Actually, when I was 16, she gave me a what do you call it when a finger when you read somebody's
palmistry?
hand? She did a palmistry on me when I was 16, and she was
really
right about some of those things. But that's just pure psychic. That's not involving the spirit world.
Well, it's funny because, everybody assumes because she was such a world-class trance medium that she would believe in the survival hypothesis. And she went to her grave. In fact, the parapsychologists were the psychical researchers spirituals were very angry with her.
Yeah.
Because she would not say that she was communicating with the beyond. And maybe it was telepathy and explain it to me, but she was ambivalent.
Her open-mindedness, and I would say that it's the same way my father was. I don't think he ever closed the door and says, no, we don't think there's a spirit world. I think he just said, we haven't found the way of measuring it in a way that we can rule out the medium's psychic ability.
I admire both of them, and not because they're beloved family members.
Sure.
But they were openly curious about everything.
Oh, absolutely.
There was a wide lens. It wasn't so focused, and they were out to prove a specific hypothesis.
Right. There was more to the world even than what they were studying.
And
but
I don't
it was a broad way.
people. I mean, I find, of course, students. I'm speaking in broad generalities, but I'm disappointed because I don't see the caliber of that type of mind, and like an Aaron Wald or that was so interested in the world around them.
The psychiatrist that studied this phenomena in the New York area. Yeah. No, I don't know. There would be very few people that would put in that category. It was a different time. I don't know why. Maybe people were just more broadly educated in general. We had, the Monty Ullman, the psychiatrists in the New York group. There's never been a group like that to take this material so seriously. I don't keep up with psychic research in England and so forth. But it was a grand day and for people and Garrett was an honest medium. You knew you didn't. I mean, you're always careful,
not
but
easy in that field.
There was so much.
The one thing she had was a sterling reputation.
That's exactly right, and that's important.
And that you can't
buy that.
But I'm also curious in that I've found a greater appreciation since I found these letters and things of Garrett, unpublished writings, that she was very much more spiritual than she came to be known with all the experiments and the support of science and parapsychology. And I wanted to ask you, because I remember growing up that it was the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, which I would resonate now too, and I would feel that she would much more. But then she also took the road of experimenting and this and that. And I wonder at the end of their life, or where do you and I sit now? Would we be, how do we feel about that? Because we've been both for years upping the banner of their good works.
Right, yeah.
And yet where are we in this?
Strange to say, maybe I'm not very creative, but I still resonate to what my father was saying and what his ideas were about the nature of man and consciousness. Now it's consciousness. That's the buzzword now. It's no longer mind. We know the mind exists.
When did you switch the name? And why? For trying to get the word out about his good work? Or when?
I would have to say it's in more recent times. Since JB's time, I would say it's since the time that John Cruz came to be our executive director, or maybe a little before that. But that's also reflecting what I think across the country, other people like probably Dean Radin and other people are talking about consciousness. It's probably a word that's resonates to people more than, say, mind. Psychology, the joke is it lost its mind back when it went in the behavioristic time. And this is the time that JB came around. So in William McDougall talking about mind, that was
unless it's just how
different.
life
it's a cycle.
It's a cycle, and we've come around again. I mean,
the public, if we're talking about the major number of people that we would like to be watching any videos that you produce or books that you write, would be saying, why are you such esoteric things? I mean, we know this is, except for the skeptics that are not going to be listening anyway. The Randy type of people who say this is all baloney and all. Your grandmother was a fraud, and so was JB. They were spending their life just cheating
JB was
people.
Deluded. She was a fraud. And he was deluded.
He was deluded, but it's all right. Yeah, right, exactly. Well, other than that, I think the general public just says, well, I have dreams that come true. Maybe they don't have visions. Maybe they don't all know that some people feel that their grandmother is talking to them or their angels are talking to them. So I think that's what we're talking about today. We don't know that all either.
But it's very hard to make it accessible and to be to all things,
Exactly.
not to all people, but to be able to reside and be held in good repute by these different camps. You and I we've been picking our way through minefields, it seems.
Yes, we grew up learning to know that there were people who weren't going to just run up and say, "This is wonderful what you're doing. I'm so glad you're doing that. Here, let me write you a check for doing it." We grew up knowing that, and even so, we still think. I know in this room here that I'm sitting in now, once a week we have an hour and a half meeting of people, or maybe it's not quite filled yet, but. Of people that
but
want
you have a core
group that are so interested in it, are so fascinated, and some of them are young. There was a woman, actually from Germany, who wondered in the other day for Duke students to hear about it. But we often have young people, but not as many as we'd liked, and that's why I think your move to getting into the visual world and getting appealing to young people.
I hope so, to tease them out or let them know that there is a community.
In this country.
And then,
as well as, I don't know about Europe, just how they're well doing.
Well, certainly organized parapsychological research and in an educational manner seems to be very fruitful over there. The Brits and
right, and they've sort of changed the way of talking about it, using a little different language.
They seem much more at ease with the subject matter too, right? I mean,
I think Britain is
over here in America, we're still thumping Bibles and getting a little nervous. And
right. On the one hand, you could go too far if you run into organized religion. On the other hand, you run into organized science of the conventional sort.
An interest in this field and the phenomena brings you up against a wall, doesn't it? It forces you to examine all sorts of concepts and
and to have a broad viewpoint, because I've been so busy like you in the trenches right now,
the organizations going,
right? And it's only in the last few years that I've been able to think a little more. I'm not running the place like you still are. Well, and give yourself 20 years.
Pretty. Yeah, that's true. Well, hopefully, I'm lucky. I have a daughter that's a fourth generation.
Yes, that's wonderful. Yeah.
But let me ask you: did you have an early understanding of what the family was involved in?
I can remember when Mrs. McDougall said to us, 3 little girls, that my 2 younger sisters, she says, "Children, you got to keep quiet now. Don't you know your father's a famous man?" Oh, father's a famous man. Well, wow. And so then thereafter, because there were a number of people coming by, interesting people all the time, like Mrs. Garrett, and so you figured they were. And then I knew that my friends didn't have people like that talking about their parents that way. So it sort of filtered in that way, but not in other ways. He'd be on the telephone talking, sometimes late at night, and be people who would call him at all hours, and he would, those interruptions of that sort, those are not necessarily. And then when I was a teenager, he got seriously ill, very ill. And the doctor came out to the house, as they did in those days, And I can remember he went on the phone afterwards. My mother, out of earshot of my mother, but I hid behind the door, and I could hear him saying, "Look, you've got to take him in the hospital. He's J.B. Rhine is a famous man. You've got to take him into the hospital." It was wartime.
Wow.
There were not many hospital beds.
Wow.
And then I knew that being famous could be a lifesaver for
Yes,
you.
for sure.
So there are a few things like that kind of impinged on my life. But basically down here in Durham, North Carolina, it wasn't like New York City with people going in and out and, important people and so forth in the laboratory where you worked all the time. So it gradually, then when I went to college, I realized, well, it was controversial too, not only that.
Did you share that with people? Because I didn't. People say anything about, or even when I started working at the foundation, they say, "What do you do?" At the PTA, what do you do? I say, I'm administrator of a nonprofit foundation.
Yeah, you could hide better.
Because but except then they say, "What foundation?" Then I'd have to say parapsychology.
Sure.
But
no.
So did you?
No, once it was
kept
out, and my last name was Rhine, and at that time, his name was fairly popular among psychologists, people like that.
Yeah.
I had a blind date once with him from a student from another campus who was a psychologist, and we were talking about famous psychologists that you knew or might have met or something, and I said, well, I know this Dr. Rhine. Oh, you do? Well, tell me about him. I know he's a fraud, kind of was like the innuendo. And I strung him along for a while. I said,
Did you really?
I knew him quite well. I mean, if he walked in the door now, I'd hug him.
Love it. I
didn't say I sat on his lap sometimes when I was younger, but
sure, yeah.
So,
did you ever come out of the closet with that one? And he wasn't a keeper.
He was he was so impressed that he took me down to his college one time to introduce me to his professors and so forth. So it got me a little bit of prestige. It was more like an oddity.
That's so funny. Now, did they ever have you run any of the card guessing? Isn't there a famous picture of you?
It's probably up on the wall around here somewhere.
Yes,
If we tour the building, you'll see some photographs. Sure. I was a subject as a child. I was pretty good as a good subject as a child, and then my family. I mean, when they started doing the dice throwing.
I liked that because we had a dice machine, but
really?
I thought that was a lot of fun.
See, that was interesting because that came along in the 30s before it became public. They collected data for almost 10 years before they dared publish it. And it began around the house, just throwing dice in a box and so forth.
Oh, see, no, I remember some mechanized thing.
And then it became mechanized.
In the 60s or whatever.
The machine over here we can show you.
Went down the chute. And
absolutely.
That was, And
the dice throwing, that was unique there. That didn't come from the British psychic research people. That was
that generated here?
That was generated here over at the Duke lab over here.
Yes, so that was probably
a gambler came by one day and talked about it and explained how he could do it. He didn't demonstrate it significantly, particularly, but it gave JB the idea. Oh, that can be studied scientifically. So you see the value of science even now, even if science isn't paid attention to. They do help you discover new things, like all the technology we've got right now. We wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for science.
On the road to finding something.
Unfortunately, we haven't yet discovered how to take that energy, which caused your batteries to die when you were speaking in whatever, or the dice to be affected. We haven't yet discovered how to convert that energy. But in our laboratory right now here, we're getting some signs of some unusual energy. We'll hear about that later.
That's good. I could deal with a jolt of that, dear.
Yeah, you could. You may.
Well, do you feel any responsibility to carry on their work at first as opposed to now? I mean,
I never did feel like I have to say that JB and my mother were both very, Louisa, were both protective, I think, and I think behind the scenes, when I once mentioned I thought I would maybe transfer from Ohio College to Duke. My mother wrote me privately, "Don't mention this to your dad because he'll get all excited about you coming back home again." So for college, so I didn't. So they were protective, particularly my mother. The times I felt protective were really in recent years when this place was in serious trouble. And actually, Dr. Robert John said to me, "Sally, I will vote on the board to do such and such and such if you will step in. He didn't say to be director. And then later when
you've been in and out. I mean,
I'm in and out when other people won't do it, and I don't charge much for I'm free.
That's how my mother, before Garrett died in 70, and Garrett started casting around in the late 60s for a possible successor. And she was trying to convince Ian Stevenson.
Yes.
And other people. And none of them would take her up on it, realizing that the relationship with Mrs. Bolton, money is capricious or whatever, and fearing that if Garrett was gone, and so who knew? So it wasn't. That's why people think that this was that it's a family affair, and it was nobody else would step up to the plate. So in '97, in '70, when Garrett died, my mother sort of looked around. There were no takers, so she had to.
And there wasn't. It's not like there was for sure a real salary going with it.
No, there's no pensions and
that's
perks.
That's the bottom line.
It's a labor of love.
Lisette, really that if there was funding, and there are plenty of good people out there. Not plenty, but there's some good people out there.
No.
And those that are working for you could be working more and better had they had good salaries and they had assistance.
You know what I think, and I may be patting you and me on the back, but I think maybe some of our success, not measured by
anything,
whatever, is because we weren't coming from the areas of expertise or academia in one particular area, and it's more like seeing the big picture. And because we're a very unique, because we were thrown into this big soup, right? And we weren't particularly emotionally passionate about it, and sort of it was just accepted, that maybe our efforts have been somewhat successful, and possibly we ran the places better, I'd like to think, than somebody else who came in and,
Well, that could be true for you. I'm not so sure.
No, come on, Sally. I think people were at death's door also with the organizations. We're always on the brink.
I think if you believe in it yourself, and then your children do, and they're willing to commit themselves to it, at not any great, there's no great, as I say, no great prestige that went along with it. Maybe get your picture in the paper.
Well, you had a career. I mean, you went with
right, and I was still in my other career when I merged into this one, and my other career sort of paid for my time here.
Yeah.
But it was time to retire from that, and I got hooked, like maybe other people in the family will get hooked.
Well, that's
and then you begin to realize this is so important that if I don't do it, other people can move away and leave, and it doesn't cast an aspersion onto this. But if you walk away, people say, well, maybe nothing's there.
I know.
So you're kind of hooked.
You're hooked.
In that sense, you're responsible.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I feel that way more now because the more I'm involved in it, and I see the wonderful energy, and I see what's really going on. You have to be here to kind of really know, or get those stories that are mailed into us all the time. That's really that was my mother's side of the field.
Oh, sure,
and it really hooked me, and that's where I would go because.
Well, again, that's the human condition.
Too many people out here need us. They need us to know that they're not crazy. Mm-hmm. Now, all the psychiatrists in the world they go to who might say, well, I can't find anything wrong.
Well, some of them do need Thorazine. They are talking to a tree.
No,
but there is definitely a possibility that, right? No.
And that's important because
that is,
when many people who write, not many, but a few people who write to us, we say, you need to go see your counselor and take your medication.
Well, remember, I tried to do the foundation did a counseling bureau because I felt we remember, and that started. And we had a conference, a couple of them, on clinical aspects of parapsychology, and but the board made me get rid of it because fear of litigation.
That's
and
right.
they let me have the participants, the clinicians would submit their copies of their insurance or whatever.
Sure.
And then they said, well, no, and then you heard awful stories in the news about people getting jumped on. So somehow they said, Lisa, it's time to go.
You really do have to be careful. We are not a counseling center.
Exactly.
We don't do counseling.
And yet
but
your
we
heart
can
goes
listen
out.
and you share.
For sure.
Exactly. So it's a fine line, but I think it's an important line, and why I think this work has to be continued for no other reason. But I think there are other reasons, and I think that finding out what this energy is, what caused things to break down, and what what are still happening.
Yeah, there's a mystery of
Yeah.
this human condition that we haven't.
But it is a lot slower than JB and Eileen thought it would be to get to this point.
That's true. Do you think they'd still be in it? Because they were both very
Yes.
driven, and but also they wanted results too, right?
But the last words that my father wrote in his the day he died, I think, was the work must continue. And I think that was his driving force and so forth. And
it's funny.
You know.
Gonzalo was filming a little bit of my statements, and I was reading a statement that my mother made, and I teared up all of a sudden. It sort of surprised me. But it was precisely what you're saying, right? About the work must go on,
I think so.
because we haven't reached the answers yet, and it just must go on.
Until somebody else takes it on, maybe puts it into a different name, like they're doing in England on anomalistic psychology, which is, I don't think, the name that I really think this is. It's much more than that.
Well, I'm kind of stuck with parapsychology, because
You
Parapsychology
are.
Foundation, I mean, I
Well,
can't. Well, although we've had
developed
conversations about
parapsychology.
rebranding,
Yes.
renaming, and then I thought,
Yeah.
after 65 years, you don't suddenly change course.
And you're
right,
not
with
going to
the
fool
name.
people, basically, anyway. I wish I had a daughter or a granddaughter at this point in time who were in the field, so I could really ask them, well, what are your friends are saying, and think. But we've got John Cruz, who can speak to that group and population and
You
find
have a
out.
window on the outside.
Right, and I don't have to do it anymore. I'm not like you in such a responsible position, which is a great joy to me. I can now do what I want to. Doing fundraising lately, I've been getting on the telephone and calling people because I can do it.
Cold calling.
Well, I'm beginning to like it.
You really?
Not cold
You
call,
wanna give
because
me
I'm
a
calling
primer
people. Well,
on
I'm calling
this?
people who know us. I'm not calling Joe Blow down the street. I'm calling Joe, who used to come, but I haven't seen him lately, and
Will
I
you
can.
guilt him into hello, we're still here?
Yeah, I just tell him what's going on. That's all.
Okay. Well, that's a direct. Maybe I should. Maybe
Yeah, it gets to
off
be
camera,
fun.
you'll have to, help me perfect my technique, because I don't have one yet.
Oh,
So that would be good.
Lisette, you do. Your technique is being yourself,
Well, listen.
and you're doing so well on Facebook.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You really
Okay.
are.
Well, listen. I want to, before we close, I know there hasn't been much written about the very special relationship, I think, that JB and Mrs. G had. Although he always called her Mrs. Garrett, correct?
Oh, he was very proper.
But Mrs. Garrett. But she called him the boss, because I found
maybe
a
that's
lot
where
of
it
the letters.
started.
It's the boss, and I wondered whether you knew.
We were wondering.
What is the boss? Because
We were wondering the other day where he got
boss.
that name, and I thought it was some of the impudent staff. He had some, they had some pretty lively people there around. I
she
thought it
would-
was Betty Humphrey or someone like that.
I don't know whether she
could have been.
co-opted it from that, but always the boss. And
At a certain period of time. She
and I know
probably
my
called
mother in this conference that just shortly before he died, I guess in the 70s or whatever, in San Francisco, she was still referring. My mother
Still
said, "Can I
calling about
call
the
you
boss."
the boss?" And it was a very sweet
sure.
moment between the two of them,
Oh.
or whatever.
That's great.
But
I think they were he was very fond of her. I never heard
think
anything.
so.
I never heard
so.
any
I think they were
negatives.
frustrated with each other
Oh, yeah.
at times.
Oh, clearly.
And in their
He was doing
correspondence,
this
they
boring-
would tend to give each other the needle.
He was doing this boring stuff, and she was whatever. I mean, he got upset if his students were his staff was interested in astrology. He'd say, no,
Oh, well,
Esteban,
yes.
that's not scientific.
No, that's like ufology, astrology.
Exactly.
Please
Oh, no.
perish the thought. But I came across, and you also helped me with vignettes of people who actually knew Garrett. That
Yes.
once I did her autobiography, I published some vignettes trying to
right.
tease out the personality.
Yes.
And I found something that Rhea White, her presentation, and I thought today, because there is such a complementary relationship between us and such a warm family one, that you might have to revisit and would like. And she said that she had arrived apparently at the parapsychology laboratory at Duke. I believe it was in 1955. I had arrived in September 54. Eileen Garrett with her entourage, funny enough, you mentioned entourage, came into Durham to visit for a few days. J.B. Rhine presided over coffee hour every morning.
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah.
Which was attended by all staff members. He told us what was new, including anything of note in recent mail or phone calls. One morning he told Mrs. Garrett was coming, and he briefly mentioned the ESP tests he'd given her years earlier and told us something about her. I'd been reading her magazine Tomorrow and especially liked her editorials, and she goes on saying that she really didn't know what to expect, that Garrett was arriving. La Garrett, as my mother would refer to her. So apparently, let me continue. The dinner that they went to, she said, the dinner that evening was an enthralling experience. All of us were captivated, not only by Eileen, but also by seeing a side of JB with which we newcomers, at least, were not familiar. These two were both used to being in charge. We would definitely agree to that, wouldn't we? In charge. Both with styles that could be characterized as dictatorial, warts and all, as I mentioned, and both coming from different positions concerning psychic phenomena and their investigation. Garrett had known the inner side since childhood. JB was the world leader as regards investigation. He was highly rational and had good common sense, although his wife, Liza, had even more, she says. So
everybody
I don't know
knew
if she's going to sleep. Well, Ray is not here. She can explain herself to JB wherever they are.
He would have agreed. He would have agreed more than anyone.
Whereas Mrs. Garrett, as a psychic, sometimes came from left field. I already knew how she could throw you. Both were extremely adept at repartee and one-upmanship. Garrett was seated in the middle on one side of the long table, and JB was opposite her. I felt we were witnessing a rare display of fireworks, somewhat tempered, so that no one would get hurt. Relations between Rhine and Garrett had been on and off, hot and cold, and we were entering a hot period following a cold one. So each one was being well disposed toward the other. Garrett was always interested in funding research, hence she formed the Parapsychology Foundation. Who better to fund than Rhine's lab? Rhine was fervently dedicated to research, and the lab always needed more money to carry out all the projects he envisioned. So on the surface, they had this very polite political conversation going back and forth. I felt like I was watching a ping-pong match with star players. But quite frequently, always quite subtly, a little barb would zip across the table from one to the other. Both continued to smile, but if you knew some of the background, you could feel the sting one of them must be experiencing. The exchange was definitely two-sided, and as I recall, it was a standoff. I identified with both of them, so I felt I was both punching and being punched. My adrenaline was pumping that night. I loved it. Louis Rhine, Gaither Pratt, Dorothy Pope, and Martin Ebon probably caught all of the repartee, whereas the rest of us only got some of it. Anyway, it was one of the best entertaining evenings of my life. It gave all us newcomers, Wynne Nielsen, Gordon Mangan and his wife, Bob Vandercastle and his wife, and maybe even Carlos Osis and his wife, who had preceded us by a year or so, and myself, the feeling that we had truly been behind the scenes of parapsychology that night, watching the movers and shakers moving and shaking while we laughed and applauded and looked at one another as if to say, did he or she really just say what I think he or she said? So I thought that was a rather charming.
That is very well.
Isn't that sweet?
Said.
Yeah,
I'm so glad she did that. Wrote that down.
Really nice, really nice.
Oh, I know all those names. Oh.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The days gone by, but never mind. We've got a whole Rolodex of names of our own, don't we, my dear? For sure.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I'll leave it to other generations to pick your personality and mine apart. Right.
Well, I know that my
well, at least I'm in
conversations,
good company, right?
My conversations with you have just been so inspiring over the years, and I wish you were.
Well, the two of us. Let's make a deal. If I falter, you pick up the spit, and if you fall, I'll pick up the thing. How that?
Well, yeah.
After all, because I don't want to.
I may precede you, and I'll
I don't know.
pave
This
the
place
way.
is killing me, so we'll just see, right? For sure.
Bye, my dear.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
very
coming and doing this.
All right.